We all know that war is a bad thing, and when a war starts, there's always bad things that come with it. Some things happen that when you compare them to the war is nothing. If you see the video about Joseph Mengele, it's one of those things. A disaster that happened in World War II. A war that changed the world. It wasn't only the Nazis. In the same war, there was a place on the other side of the world. Japan's Unit 731. In World War II, Japan was a superpower, and it controlled the eastern part of Asia. Japan was part of the Axis powers that fought the Allies. In that time, east of China, Philippines, Korea, and parts of Russia were in Japan's hands. So in that time, the eastern part of China was in Japan's hand. And Unit 731 was in today's China. Unit 731 was kind of like a laboratory, and they did chemical and biological testing. If you visit laboratories all around the world, in all of those labs, all the testing is done on mice. But in Unit 731, exactly like Auschwitz, the experiments were all done on humans. You have to know that Unit 731 was pretty much a prison that had laboratories, and in a span of 5 years, meaning from 1940 to 1945, 400,000 people were killed. But between these 400,000 people, 3,000 people were chosen to be experimented on. Most of these people were Chinese, and there were some Koreans, Mongols, and Russians. We are not sure how they picked the people, and why these 3,000 people were chosen from the other ones. One of the experiments was experimenting in the cold, an experiment Joseph Mengele was trying at the same time, because the biggest problem for the soldiers at that time were the cold, and they wanted to figure out a way to help the soldiers survive in the winter. Outside of this prison was extremely cold. They would walk the person outside and they would hold him until he starts freezing, and you start seeing frostbite. When he got to that point, they would bring him inside so the doctors can run experiments on the body. The people that were released from this prison would explain they would take the people outside in the freezing cold, and since they wanted them to freeze faster, they would pour freezing water on top of them. And when they were freezing, one of the soldiers would have a stick, and then he would proceed to hit the prisoner with it. And the reason for that was, if it made a louder noise than a human body, it's time to go inside. The person that they would take inside was pretty much dead, but they wanted to try other things to bring him back to life and figure out how you can make a person unfreeze. They tried all types of experiments on these freezing prisoners. Sometimes they would pour warm water on top of them. There was also boiling water used on top of them as well. Some of these people would be chosen to get a disease. They would inject some things to force them to get sick. When they would get sick, they would go to the surgery room. Without any anesthesia or painkillers, they would open up the patient. They just wanted to know what this disease does inside the body. When they open up the person's body, they would most likely die from pain. Another test they did in Unit 731 was testing sicknesses. For this test, they needed a bunch of people to have this sickness, and that is why the people inside the prison weren't enough for this experiment. They would make disease-filled liquids, put them in planes, and go spray on type of Chinese towns. Then they would look at the town and see what's going on. They would see what this sickness is doing, and sometimes they would even take some subjects from the town to Unit 731. The reason they did this was to see if it's worth it to try bigger cities, and to try it on their biggest enemies, mostly the United States. They wanted to put disease-filled liquid inside of balloons and fly it over the United States. But let's get back to Unit 731. Japanese people have this attitude that everything has to be well done, and that is why they wanted to make the best weapons as well. And for testing these weapons, they would use these poor prisoners. They would use different types of weapons in different ranges to see which one is more effective. They would test different grenades from different distances as well. They would release gas on prisoners as well to see which one is more deadly. They wanted to see from what distance this gas is deadly. Or they wanted to see what a human does inside a pressure chamber. They would put people inside pressure chambers, and when they go in there, in the first couple seconds, their eyes would pop out. Then they would die. The interesting part is, some of the colleges that had medical students would send these students to Unit 731 to do tests on human subjects. One of the students came clean about this place. They told them, if you want to get a medical degree, you have to go to China and do tests on humans. They would give some people syphilis, and then they would bring another prisoner and make them have sex. They wanted to see how syphilis is transferred. They would bring a man with syphilis and have a woman right there as well, and they would make him make the female pregnant. And the reason was they wanted to see if the baby comes out with syphilis. A lot of babies were born in this laboratory, but no babies left here alive. Because when a baby was born, they for sure had experiments for them. Experiments that explaining them is disturbing. Japan themselves later confessed that they did more experiments than people knew. The things we told you in the beginning, they didn't deny any of them. And they added 4 more things they did over there. One of the tests were exposing people to radiation, meaning they would send radioactive waves to see what happens. Another experiment was that they would replace human blood with animal blood, and they wanted to see what happens to the person. Another one, they would put salty seawater inside a human body. And last but not least, they said they would burn people alive to see what happens. Can you believe it? How bad some people are? There's a reason that Chinese people and Koreans are still mad at Japan, and they ask them to apologize for what they did. The Germans apologized for everything the Nazis did, but the Japanese haven't apologized to anybody. Even to the Chinese, which they did the most damage to. And worst of all, they acknowledge the people that did all this, and look at them as heroes.